I am Calvin, 65 years old, and I have spent my entire life working the soil and keeping my mouth shut. When my only son Justin got married, I kept quiet about the fact that I had inherited my late wife Barbara's sprawling Montana ranch. It was a good thing I stayed silent, because 2 weeks after the wedding, my new daughter-in-law showed up at my door with a bribed notary fully intending to steal my tiny pension and throw me into an asylum. But her smug, victorious smile permanently disappeared when she realized the broke old man she was trying to evict was actually the sole owner of the very ground she was standing on. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to greedy, arrogant people who completely underestimated your worth. Justin and Vanessa's wedding was a spectacle of modern, aggressive wealth, the kind of lavish outdoor affair that costs more than what most honest folks earn in a decade of hard labor. They had rented a massive, pristine estate with manicured lawns, towering floral arches, and crystal chandeliers suspended by thick ropes from ancient oak trees. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated relentlessly with silver trays of champagne and expensive caviar. I was there, of course, the father of the groom. But if you looked for me in the front row during the ceremony, or at the head table during the reception, you would be looking in vain. They had seated me at table 42, tucked away in the far back corner, right next to the noisy, steaming catering tents. It was the absolute edge of the reception, practically hidden in the shadows, where the wealthy guests would not have to accidentally look at me. I was wearing my best suit, but it was faded and 20 years out of style. My boots, though clean and polished, were worn down at the heels from decades of walking rough terrain. I knew I stuck out like a sore thumb among the sea of designer silk gowns and custom-tailored tuxedos, but I did not care. I was there to see my boy get married. I live in a rusted, weather-beaten cabin on the edge of a massive Montana ranch. For as long as anyone in Justin's new social circle knew, I was just a retired, broken-down ranch hand. They all assumed I was a tenant, a charity case allowed to live out my final days in a shack out of pity, clutching a meager mechanic's pension to buy my weekly groceries. They did not know the truth. They did not know that when my beloved wife Barbara passed away, she left me sole ownership of 2,000 acres of prime, unmortgaged land. It was an empire of rich soil, fresh water, and timber, entirely debt-free. I kept it a secret from Justin, because I wanted him to build his own life. I wanted him to understand the value of a dollar earned through his own sweat, rather than waiting around for an inheritance to fund an easy lifestyle. As I sat quietly at my hidden table sipping a glass of iced water, the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive cologne assaulted my senses. It was Vanessa's father, a loud, aggressive real estate developer who made his fortune paving over green spaces to build concrete shopping centers. He sauntered over to my table with a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, flanked by 2 of his wealthy business partners. He did not come over to thank me for raising the man his daughter was marrying. He came to gloat. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my frayed suit cuffs and my scuffed leather boots. He let out a booming, theatrical laugh and asked if I had ridden a mule all the way from my shack to the wedding. His partners chuckled right on cue, swirling their drinks. He loudly proclaimed that it was a good thing Vanessa was bringing Justin into a real family, one that could elevate him from his pathetic, dirt-poor roots. I simply looked at him, my expression completely blank, and took another sip of my water. My silence only seemed to irritate his massive ego, but he eventually wandered off to find a more reactive audience. Moments later, Justin and Vanessa made their rounds to greet the guests. Vanessa was radiant in a custom silk gown that probably cost $50,000. Justin looked sharp but nervous, constantly adjusting his tie and looking around to make sure everyone was impressed. As they approached the rear tables, they stopped a few yards away from me, hidden behind a towering floral arrangement. They assumed the loud clattering of plates from the catering tent masked their voices, but 40 years of hunting in the quiet woods had given me excellent hearing. I heard Vanessa lean in and whisper to my son. Her voice was pure ice. She told Justin that his charity case father was ruining the entire aesthetic of her perfect day. She said my presence was an absolute embarrassment, a stain on their sophisticated image, and aggressively asked why I could not have just stayed hidden in my rusted cabin where I belonged. I sat frozen, waiting for my son to defend me. I waited for the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had taught to fish and drive and respect his elders, to tell his new wife that she was crossing an unforgivable line. But Justin did not defend me. He looked at the ground, shifted his weight, and muttered a quiet apology to her. He completely agreed, promising to keep me out of the professional wedding photos so I would not ruin their album. That agreement, that cowardly whisper of submission, shattered something deep inside my chest. The son I raised died in that exact moment, replaced by a stranger willing to trade his own father for a temporary seat at the table of the elite. I remained entirely silent, absorbing the profound betrayal, without letting a single emotion show on my face. A few minutes later, Vanessa approached my table for the obligatory fake photo op greeting. She plastered on a radiant artificial smile, leaning down to give me a stiff, contactless hug for the roaming photographer. As she leaned over, her heavy, oversized designer purse slipped from her shoulder and tipped over onto the grass. A few items spilled out near my worn boots. A tube of expensive lipstick, a compact mirror, and a folded piece of heavy stock paper. I calmly knelt down to help her gather her things. My rough fingers brushed against the folded paper. As I picked it up, it fell open just slightly. My eyes are sharp and my mind is sharper. I saw the bold red lettering at the very top of the page. It was a final notice of default from a major commercial lending bank. It was addressed directly to Vanessa's supposedly highly successful urban boutique. The notice demanded immediate payment of over $100,000, threatening immediate seizure of her business assets and personal property. She was not a successful entrepreneur. She was drowning in massive, suffocating debt. Her entire lifestyle of designer gowns, luxury cars, and extravagant weddings was a hollow facade built on crumbling, maxed-out credit. In a fraction of a second, I committed the bank's name, the collection agency, and the 10-digit account number to memory. I folded the paper back perfectly, handing it to her along with her lipstick. I offered her a polite, grandfatherly smile. She snatched the items from my hand without a single word of thanks, her eyes flashing with a brief, terrifying panic, before she quickly turned and marched away, pulling Justin along with her by the arm. I sat back down in my chair near the catering tent, listening to the clatter of dishes and the distant, cheerful music of the reception. They thought they had successfully humiliated a helpless, broke old man. They thought I was just an uneducated tenant who would quietly fade away into the background of their glamorous new life, never to be heard from again. I looked out over the sea of wealthy guests, keeping my absolute silence. I did not need to shout, and I did not need to cause a dramatic scene. True power does not make a sound until it is ready to strike. I sat there in the shadows, sipping my iced water, and began to calculate exactly how I was going to dismantle their entire fraudulent world piece by piece. Exactly 14 days had passed since the terrible humiliation of the wedding reception. I was sitting on the weathered wooden planks of my front porch, enjoying the quiet morning air. A cup of black coffee warmed my calloused hands. The Montana sky was a vast, clear ocean of blue, and the only sound was the wind moving gently through the tall pines. That absolute peace was violently shattered by the aggressive roar of an expensive engine. A sleek, silver luxury sport utility vehicle tore up my long dirt driveway, kicking up a massive, thick cloud of dust that coated my freshly washed truck. The vehicle skidded to a halt, mere inches from my bottom porch step. The doors swung open heavily. Justin stepped out first, wearing a sharp, dark, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place against the rugged backdrop of the working ranch. Vanessa followed him, stepping very carefully to avoid getting a single speck of dirt on her pristine designer shoes. But my son and his new wife were not alone. A third person emerged slowly from the back seat. He was a nervous-looking, overweight man, clutching a thick, black leather briefcase to his chest. He wore a cheap, wrinkled gray suit and kept wiping beads of sweat from his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. I remained seated quietly in my rocking chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee, watching the three of them march up my wooden steps like an invading army. Justin did not offer a polite greeting. He did not ask how I was doing or how I had been feeling since the wedding. He stood directly over me, casting a long, cold shadow across my worn leather boots. He pointed a rigid finger at the nervous man sweating beside him and announced that this stranger was a state-certified notary public. Justin reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents, slapping them down onto the small wooden table beside my coffee mug. His voice was completely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. He told me the time had come to face harsh reality. He claimed I was getting far too old and far too confused to live out here alone in the wilderness. He said he and Vanessa had noticed severe signs of mental decline during the wedding reception, citing my supposed inability to interact normally with their wealthy guests. He declared with a terrifyingly calm and sterile authority that they had already arranged for me to be moved into a state-run assisted living facility by the end of the week. Vanessa stood right beside him with her arms crossed tight over her chest, wearing a smug, victorious grin on her face. She chimed in, stating that the documents on the table would officially transfer my monthly pension and the physical deed to this broken-down cabin directly over to them. She said they would handle all of my finances from now on strictly for my own protection. I looked down at the daunting stack of paperwork. I recognized the standard legal formatting immediately. It was a complete and total surrender of my personal autonomy. The pages included a permanent, irrevocable power of attorney and a full quitclaim deed. If valid, these documents would hand them complete control over the tiny fraction of the property they believed I owned. I looked up at my son, searching his face for any remaining trace of the boy I had lovingly raised, but his eyes were totally empty. He coldly added that if I refused to sign the papers voluntarily, they would call Adult Protective Services today. He promised he would testify under oath in a court of law that I was an imminent danger to myself. He threatened to tell the authorities that I was wandering the woods at night and that I was completely incapable of basic survival. They would force me into a locked medical ward against my will. They fully expected me to rage. They expected me to yell, to throw things, and to violently kick them off my porch. But I remembered what my late wife Barbara used to tell me when dealing with angry cattle. She always said that loud aggression is a useless weapon, but quiet patience is a silent executioner. I decided right then and there to give them exactly the helpless victim they desperately wanted to see. I let my broad shoulders slump forward. I let my large hands tremble slightly against my knees. I looked down at the wooden table and allowed my face to go slack, with apparent confusion and deep fear. I stammered weakly, asking Justin if I was really losing my mind. I asked with a trembling voice if the medical facility would let me keep my favorite rocking chair. My performance of a broken old man was absolutely flawless. The sudden dramatic shift in my demeanor lowered their guard entirely. Justin let out a heavy, impatient sigh and told me not to make this transition harder than it had to be. While he was distracting the nervous, corrupt notary with aggressive instructions on exactly where to stamp the pages, I slipped my right hand deep into my flannel jacket pocket. My fingers quickly found the small digital voice recorder I always carried to dictate daily ranch maintenance notes. I pressed the record button blindly, capturing the clear, crisp audio of their blatant extortion. The notary hastily shoved a plastic pen into my hand, telling me to sign my name on the 4 highlighted lines at the bottom of the pages. Here is a piece of personal history Justin had completely forgotten in his greedy rush. 20 years ago, I shattered my right collarbone falling off a spooked horse. For 6 long months, I had to learn to do absolutely everything with my left hand, including signing important bank checks. But a signature executed with the non-dominant hand, especially when deliberately altered, can be easily proven as invalid under strict legal scrutiny. I took the black pen with my left hand, letting my fingers shake violently. I pressed the ink to the thick paper. My full legal name is Calvin Thomas Hayes. On every single line I signed Calvin Thomas Hayes, deliberately omitting the letter H from my middle name. I made the ink loops jagged, erratic, and sloppy. It looked exactly like the desperate signature of a terrified, confused old man rapidly losing his cognitive function. Legally speaking, it was a completely worthless piece of paper. I slowly slid the signed documents back across the small wooden table. The corrupt notary hastily stamped and sealed them without even asking to check my identification, eager to collect his illegal bribe and flee the remote property. Vanessa snatched the papers up hungrily, clutching them to her chest as if they were winning lottery tickets. Her fake, polite smile vanished entirely, replaced by a look of absolute venomous greed. She looked around my beautiful, peaceful porch with pure disgust and told Justin that this shack was a complete and utter eyesore. Without bothering to lower her voice, she declared that as soon as I was locked away securely in the state home on Friday, they would bring in the heavy machinery. She explicitly stated on my hidden recording that they were going to ruthlessly bulldoze the entire historic cabin by the end of the month, just to clear the view for their future plans. Justin nodded in eager agreement, adding that the land was worth significantly more without the trash sitting on it. They turned their backs on me without another word. They did not say goodbye. They did not offer a final hug. They did not look back even once. They climbed quickly into their luxury vehicle and sped away down the long dirt road, leaving me completely alone in a thick cloud of dust. I sat calmly in my rocking chair and reached into my pocket to stop the digital recording. I slipped the small device safely back inside my jacket. They drove away firmly, believing they had successfully stolen my entire life. They had absolutely no idea they had just blindly handed me the very rope I would soon use to hang them both. The sun had barely broken over the jagged peaks of the Montana mountains when I stepped out onto the damp grass of my front yard. The crisp morning air filled my lungs, carrying the familiar scent of pine and wet earth. For over 40 years, this land had been my sanctuary. It was a sprawling, wild paradise that my late wife Barbara and I had explored inch by inch. I was standing there holding a battered tin cup of black coffee, letting the absolute silence of the property wash over me, when a strange, unnatural noise shattered the peace. It was a high-pitched mechanical whine buzzing like an oversized angry hornet. I set my coffee down on the porch railing and narrowed my eyes, scanning the clear blue sky. Over the eastern ridge, about 2 miles from my cabin, I spotted a small black object hovering steadily above the tree line. It was a commercial drone. I walked back inside my cabin and retrieved my heavy-duty binoculars from the kitchen drawer. Pressing the lenses to my eyes, I focused on the distant ridge. The drone was moving in a precise, calculated grid pattern, sweeping back and forth across the virgin timber and the pristine creek that fed the lower pastures. Following the drone's flight path downward, my lenses caught the glint of morning sunlight, reflecting off a white pickup truck parked illegally near my eastern fence line. A man wearing a bright neon orange safety vest was standing on the bed of the truck, operating a large remote control console. Someone was actively surveying my property without my permission. A younger, more impulsive version of myself might have grabbed the heavy hunting rifle I kept secured in the bedroom closet. I could have driven out there, fired a warning shot into the dirt, and chased the trespasser entirely off my land. But the events of the previous day had changed my perspective entirely. Aggression would only give my son Justin and his greedy new wife exactly what they wanted. It would give them a police report documenting an unstable, dangerous old man acting violently. I had to be smarter than that. I walked to the kitchen counter, grabbed my large insulated thermos, filled it to the brim with hot coffee, and grabbed 2 clean paper cups. I walked out to my rusted pickup truck, tossed the thermos onto the passenger seat, and began the slow, bumpy drive up toward the eastern ridge. As my truck rattled over the uneven dirt path, I kept my mind perfectly clear. I arrived at the fence line and parked a few yards away from the white truck. The surveyor was a young man, probably no older than 25, wearing expensive hiking boots and designer sunglasses. He looked up from his remote control console as I stepped out of my truck, taking in my faded denim jacket and my worn-out boots. He immediately adopted that same condescending, pitying look I had seen on the faces of the wedding guests. I approached him slowly, putting on my best performance of a harmless, confused old ranch hand. I offered him a warm, gentle smile and asked him if he was lost. I told him this was private property and the main highway was a few miles back the other way. The young man chuckled, adjusting his sunglasses. He spoke to me slowly and loudly, as if I were deaf or entirely uneducated. He told me he was not lost at all. He claimed he was a certified topographical surveyor hired by a major corporate development firm. He proudly announced that he was mapping out the elevations and the water lines for a massive upcoming project. He said the firm was planning to break ground on a multi-million-dollar luxury eco-resort and spa right here on this ridge. I let my jaw drop slightly, acting completely bewildered by his words. I stammered, playing the part of a terrified tenant, asking him who could have possibly authorized such a massive project on this land. The young man let out an impatient sigh, pulling a digital tablet from his equipment bag. He tapped the screen a few times and shoved it toward my face. He told me the actual owner of the property had authorized the survey. I looked at the bright screen. It was an official work order email giving explicit permission for a full commercial land survey. At the bottom of the email was the electronic signature of Justin Hayes. My own son had signed the document, falsely listing himself as the sole legal owner and managing director of the estate. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Justin had not even waited for the corrupt notary to file the forged papers we had signed yesterday. He was already acting as the undisputed king of my empire. Instead of ripping the tablet from the young man's hands, I simply nodded my head slowly, keeping my eyes wide and fearful. I told him I was just the old caretaker, and I did not want to cause any trouble with the new bosses. The surveyor smiled smugly, clearly enjoying his perceived authority over me. I walked back to my truck and grabbed the heavy thermos and the paper cups. I returned to the fence line, offering him a cup of hot coffee to ward off the morning chill. He accepted it gladly, setting his remote control console down on the tailgate of his truck, while he sipped the coffee and bragged about how many acres his drone could map in a single hour. I moved closer to his equipment. I kept my hands shaking slightly, playing the fascinated old man, marveling at his modern technology. I reached into my jacket pocket and palmed my smartphone, keeping it hidden behind my forearm. As the surveyor turned his head to look up at the hovering drone, I quickly and silently snapped 3 high-resolution photographs. I photographed the bright blue identification badge hanging from his vest. I photographed the corporate work order still glowing on his tablet screen. Finally, I photographed the Federal Aviation Registration Number printed clearly on the side of his spare drone battery box. I slipped my phone back into my pocket before he turned around. I thanked him for his time, wished him a good day of work, and drove my rusted truck back down the mountain. When I returned to the safety of my cabin, I locked the front door and closed all the heavy wooden blinds. I walked past the rustic living room and went directly into my bedroom. I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy oak dresser, moved aside a stack of old winter sweaters, and pulled out a sleek, state-of-the-art encrypted laptop. It was a secure device provided to me by my wealth manager, Russell, designed specifically for managing my offshore accounts and corporate investments. I opened the laptop and booted up the secure network. The naive, helpless old man vanished the moment my fingers touched the keyboard. I uploaded the covert photographs I had taken on the ridge. I zoomed in on the corporate logo printed on the surveyor's work order. The company was listed as Apex Horizon Development. I opened a secure browser and accessed the state's corporate registry database. I ran a deep search on the name. The initial search revealed that Apex Horizon was a newly formed limited liability company registered just 3 weeks ago, right around the time of my son's wedding. I did not stop there. I traced the corporate registration number through the labyrinth of state tax records and business filings. I followed the paper trail as it jumped from one anonymous shell company to another, deliberately designed to hide the true owner's identity. But they had left a digital footprint in their rush to incorporate. The final holding company listed on the tax routing documents was a massive commercial real estate conglomerate based in the city. I stared at the bright screen, my heart beating with a steady, cold rhythm. The conglomerate was entirely owned and operated by Vanessa's father. It was the exact same loud, arrogant man who had mocked my worn boots and faded suit at the wedding reception. The entire puzzle snapped together with absolute terrifying clarity. This was never just about Justin and Vanessa wanting to steal a modest cabin or steal my retirement pension to pay off her failing boutique. This was a massive, highly coordinated corporate land grab. Vanessa's father had discovered that this 2,000-acre ranch was completely debt-free and situated on some of the most valuable undeveloped commercial land in the entire state. He had used his daughter to manipulate my son, turning Justin into a willing accomplice in a multi-million-dollar fraud. They intended to declare me mentally incompetent, lock me away in a heavily sedated ward, and transfer the land to their shell company for pennies on the dollar. They planned to pave over the green pastures Barbara had loved so deeply and replace them with concrete and luxury spas for the elite. I closed the laptop slowly, the quiet click echoing in the dark bedroom. They thought they were dealing with an uneducated, dirt-poor mechanic. They had no idea they had just declared war on a man who owned the very ground they intended to steal. The morning sun climbed higher over the jagged Montana peaks, casting long, deep shadows across the valley floor. I sat alone at my heavy oak desk, staring at the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. After discovering the corporate shell company the day before, I had set up automated digital alerts on the county clerk public registry. I needed to know exactly when my son and his new wife would make their next move. I did not have to wait very long. At exactly 9 in the morning, a bright red notification flashed across my secure screen. Apex Horizon Development had just filed a massive preliminary zoning permit with the county planning office. They were requesting immediate authorization to rezone the entire eastern ridge of my property for commercial luxury development. Attached to their digital application was a scanned copy of the property deed. It was the exact same piece of paper I had signed on my porch 24 hours ago, with my left hand deliberately misspelling my own middle name. The sheer reckless speed of their actions was staggering. They were not even waiting for the end of the week. They were not waiting for their corrupt doctor to write a fake medical evaluation or for the state to drag me away to an assisted living facility. They were attempting a hostile under-the-table land grab right now, before the ink was even dry on their forged documents. They assumed the local county clerks would simply rubber stamp the zoning permits for a wealthy city developer without looking too closely at the signature on a rural cabin deed. They were sprinting blindly toward their own destruction, driven by a desperate need to liquidate my property before their massive debts caught up with them. I closed the public registry window and opened my secure communications channel. I dialed a private unlisted number that routed directly to a top-floor office in a major financial district across the country. The phone rang only twice before a calm, professional voice answered. It was Russell, my private wealth manager and lead attorney. Russell had managed my late wife Barbara's estate for decades, and he was one of the very few people on earth who knew the true extent of my financial holdings. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I told him exactly what had transpired over the past 48 hours. I recounted the cruel humiliation at the wedding reception, the ambush on my front porch, the corrupt notary, and the trespassing drone surveyor. I told him about the forged deed and the zoning permit that had just been filed by the shell company. Russell remained completely silent on the other end of the line, absorbing the magnitude of the betrayal. When I finished speaking, I could hear the heavy sigh of a man who had spent his entire career watching greed destroy families. He asked me what I wanted to do and if I was ready to bring down the hammer on my own flesh and blood. I looked out my window at the sprawling green pastures that Barbara had loved so fiercely. I told Russell that the time for patience and parental forgiveness had passed. I took a deep, steady breath and told him to initiate Protocol Ironweed. Protocol Ironweed was a strict legal contingency plan Russell and I had developed a decade ago shortly after Barbara passed away. It was named after a tough, deep-rooted wildflower that grows across these plains, a plant that survives severe droughts, brutal storms, and violent attempts to pull it from the earth. The protocol was designed specifically to protect the ranch from corporate vultures, predatory developers, and hostile takeovers. I had never imagined I would ever have to use it to protect the land from my own son. As soon as I spoke the code words, Russell's fingers began flying across his keyboard. I could hear the rapid clicking through the receiver as he initiated the complex legal sequence. Within minutes, he was drafting the emergency transfer orders. Protocol Ironweed activated a labyrinth of legal protections, shielding the property behind thick layers of impenetrable corporate armor. Russell was transferring the complete title of the entire 2,000-acre estate into an irrevocable blind trust. Once the transfer was finalized, the land would be entirely locked down. No single person, no corrupt county clerk, and certainly no greedy real estate developer could touch a single blade of grass on this property. The blind trust was an absolute legal fortress, and I was its hidden architect. Russell confirmed that the transfer was processing swiftly through the secure federal registry. The forged deed my son was currently using to file his zoning permits was now doubly worthless. Not only was the signature legally invalid, but the property it claimed to transfer no longer belonged to me. It belonged to an untouchable phantom entity. I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. Barbara's legacy was perfectly safe. The rolling hills, the ancient timber forests, and the clear running creeks would never be paved over for a luxury spa. But securing the land was only the first half of our defensive strategy. Protecting the ranch stopped the bleeding, but it did not punish the thieves. I told Russell that invalidating their paperwork was simply not enough. If we merely blocked the zoning permit, Justin and Vanessa would just regroup and find another devious way to attack me. They still firmly believed they held a valid power of attorney over my finances, and they were desperate for fast cash. We needed to catch them committing an undeniable federal crime, something so concrete and verifiable that no expensive lawyer could ever argue their way out of it. We needed to set a digital trap. Russell understood exactly what I was asking for. He paused his typing and outlined a brilliant digital snare. He explained that we needed to give them something highly tempting to steal, something small enough to go unnoticed by major banking alarms, but significant enough to trigger federal wire fraud statutes when they moved the funds across state lines. Russell accessed my expansive financial portfolio and isolated a single minor checking account. It was an old account I rarely used, connected to the local town branch. He completely severed this account from my primary wealth portfolio, leaving it totally unshielded and completely visible to anyone running a basic credit check on my name. He then meticulously funded this isolated decoy account with exactly $2,500. It was a very specific, completely unsuspicious number. It looked exactly like the monthly pension deposit of a retired blue-collar mechanic. It was the absolute perfect bait. Russell then intentionally left the routing and account numbers vulnerable to the fake power of attorney document my son currently possessed. If Justin or Vanessa attempted to access my finances, this decoy account would be the very first thing they found. It would look like an incredibly easy target, a quick cash grab for a desperate couple trying to keep their drowning, lavish lifestyle afloat. Russell finalized the digital snare and activated a silent, highly advanced monitoring program on the decoy account. The program was designed to track every single keystroke, every login attempt, and every transfer request made against the funds. If they moved a single penny of that $2,500 to their own banks, the system would instantly capture their internet protocol, address the terminal identification, and the exact timestamps of the theft. By allowing the transaction to process over electronic banking networks, they would be committing irrefutable federal wire fraud. I thanked Russell for his flawless execution and ended the secure call. I closed my laptop and walked out onto the porch, looking out over the vast expanse of the newly established Ironweed Trust. The trap was perfectly set, the bait was waiting, and the steel jaws were armed. My son and his wife believed they were hunting a weak, helpless old man. They thought they were the apex predators in this scenario, closing in for the final easy kill. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into a meticulously designed cage. All I had to do now was sit back, drink my black coffee, and wait for them to take the bait. I knew it would not take long. Greed is a highly predictable, blinding force, and their mounting desperation would very soon push them right over the edge. The heat of the late afternoon sun was beating down hard on the dry Montana earth when I first heard the frantic bellowing of the herd. It is a very specific sound. Any rancher worth their salt knows the difference between a hungry calf and a terrified animal. This was the sound of deep distress. I grabbed the keys to my truck and drove out toward the eastern pasture, where I kept a herd of about 200 grazing cattle. As I crested the ridge, my stomach tightened. The massive steel water troughs that lined the edge of the grazing field were completely bone dry. The cattle were crowded around the empty metal basins, pushing against each other with parched tongues and desperate cries. The eastern pasture is completely reliant on a central utility pump that draws water from a deep underground well, pushing it nearly a mile up the hill through thick industrial pipes. If that pump fails in the dead of summer, an entire herd can succumb to dehydration in a matter of days. I jumped out of my truck and ran to the primary valve, expecting to find a blown fuse or a rusted fitting. Instead, I found something that made my blood run absolutely cold. The thick, reinforced water pipe had not burst under pressure. It had been intentionally severed. I knelt in the dirt and ran my calloused fingers over the edge of the plastic. The cut was perfectly smooth and completely straight, leaving behind a dusting of white shavings scattered in the dry grass. Someone had taken a handsaw to the main water line, deliberately bleeding the system out into the dirt ravine below. They had intentionally cut off the only drinking source for hundreds of innocent animals. I stood up slowly, looking back toward the main road. I knew exactly who had done this. My son and his new wife were growing incredibly impatient. The county clerks were likely dragging their feet on the fraudulent zoning permits, pushing back their timeline for their luxury resort development. They realized that waiting for the state bureaucracy to evict a stubborn old man could take months. They decided to accelerate the process by physically forcing me off the land. They wanted to destroy my livelihood, ruin my daily routine, and make the ranch completely uninhabitable, so I would abandon the cabin voluntarily. A profound, terrifying anger settled deep into my chest. Stealing my money was one thing. Forging my signature on a deed was a cowardly act of financial desperation. But attacking innocent animals, crossing the line into physical destruction and animal cruelty, was a boundary I could never forgive. I walked back to my truck and pulled out my heavy canvas tool bag. I did not call the local sheriff. A severed water pipe on a rural property would be written off as a minor vandalism dispute with absolutely zero physical evidence pointing toward the culprits. If I wanted to stop them, I needed irrefutable, undeniable proof. I spent the next 2 hours working in the sweltering heat, cutting away the damaged section of the pipe, applying purple primer, and cementing a brand new heavy-duty fitting into place. I stood guard until the utility pump roared back to life and the fresh, cold water began spilling into the metal troughs to relieve the desperate herd. Once the animals were safe, I drove back to my locked storage shed behind the main cabin. I bypassed the standard tools and opened a heavy steel footlocker tucked away in the back corner. Inside were 3 military-grade motion-activated trail cameras. These were not cheap commercial cameras you buy at a local sporting goods store. These were high-definition night vision devices equipped with invisible infrared flashes, perfectly designed to capture predators moving through the pitch-black timber without ever alerting them to the camera's presence. I loaded the equipment into my truck and drove back out to the eastern utility pump just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. I spent the twilight hours meticulously setting my trap. I mounted the first camera high up in the dense branches of a towering evergreen tree, angling the lens perfectly to capture a wide aerial view of the entire pump station. I secured the second camera low to the ground, hiding it completely inside a thick patch of thorny brush pointing directly at the main access road to capture the license plate of any approaching vehicle. I mounted the third and final camera directly across from the heavy machinery, dialing the focus in tightly to capture a crystal-clear image of any face that stepped within 10 feet of the hardware. I synchronized all three devices to the encrypted wireless network, routing directly to my secure laptop. I drove back to the cabin, locked the doors, and waited in the dark. The first night passed in complete silence. I sat in my leather armchair drinking black coffee, staring at the blank surveillance feed on my glowing screen. I knew they would return. The temporary fix I applied to the water line was obvious, and when they realized the cattle were still drinking, they would come back to finish the job permanently. They were arrogant, and they believed I was a helpless, confused old man, entirely incapable of defending my own territory. On the second night, shortly after 2 a.m, the silent alarm on my laptop flashed a brilliant bright red. Motion detected at the eastern pump house. I set my coffee mug down and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. The high-definition night vision feed flickered to life, bathing my screen in a ghostly green and black glow. A dark sport utility vehicle crept slowly up the dirt access road, with its headlights completely turned off. The vehicle parked silently near the fence line. The low-angle camera hidden in the brush captured the rear license plate with absolute perfect clarity. It was Vanessa's luxury vehicle. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out into the freezing night air. He pulled the hood of his dark jacket up over his head, but he was completely oblivious to the infrared camera mounted directly in front of him. The lens captured his face in stark, undeniable detail. It was Justin. The boy I had taught to walk, the boy I had taught to fish, the boy I had loved with every ounce of my soul, was sneaking onto my property like a common criminal in the dead of night. He walked straight toward the utility pump, but this time he was not carrying a simple handsaw. He was carrying a massive pair of heavy industrial bolt cutters. I watched in total silence as my son approached the expensive agricultural machinery. He did not go for the plastic pipes this time. He went directly for the heart of the system. I watched through the glowing screen as he raised the heavy steel cutters and violently snapped the thick brass padlocks securing the main electrical panel. He ripped the metal door open and began violently slashing through the thick, specialized wiring that powered the deep well engine. Sparks flew into the dark night as he destroyed the control board. He then took the heavy, blunt end of the steel cutters and repeatedly smashed the pressurized water valves, completely shattering the expensive brass fittings and ensuring the entire pumping mechanism was ruined beyond repair. He was panting heavily, his breath pluming in the cold night air, as he admired his path of destruction. He believed he had just struck a fatal blow to my daily life. He believed he had successfully ruined my ability to sustain the herd, bringing him one step closer to stealing my land. He turned around, jogged back to the waiting vehicle, tossed the bolt cutters into the trunk, and sped away into the darkness. The entire violent episode lasted less than 4 minutes. I sat back in my chair, the silence of my cabin wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. The emotional pain of watching my own flesh and blood commit such a malicious act was staggering, but the grief was immediately replaced by a cold, calculated sense of victory. Justin had absolutely no idea about the catastrophic legal mistake he had just made. He thought he was committing a simple act of rural vandalism, breaking an old man's water pipe to be a nuisance. He was entirely ignorant of the strict agricultural laws that govern this part of the country. In this state, tampering with a commercial water supply, destroying essential farming infrastructure, and deliberately endangering the lives of a livestock herd does not constitute a minor property crime. It is a severe, unpardonable offense. It elevates the act from basic vandalism to felony agricultural sabotage. It carries mandatory prison sentences and crippling financial restitution. My son had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his life. He had crossed state lines driving from his city apartment to commit a deliberate felony on my property. I did not call the police. I did not alert the county sheriff to the damaged equipment. I simply reached forward and downloaded the pristine, unedited, high-definition video files directly from the hidden cameras onto my encrypted flash drive. I secured the digital evidence inside my heavy steel safe, locking it away alongside the forged deed and the recorded audio files. The trap was growing tighter, and the walls were closing in around them faster than they could possibly comprehend. They thought they were forcing me out of my home by drying out my land, but all they had done was hand me the final nail for their own coffins. I poured myself another cup of black coffee and watched the sun slowly rise over the mountains, preparing myself for the next phase of their inevitable destruction. The call came exactly 3 days after the severed waterline incident. Justin's voice over the phone was dripping with a heavy artificial sweetness. He claimed he had been doing a lot of soul-searching and wanted to apologize for the tension between us. He invited me to a family reconciliation dinner at a premier steakhouse in the city center. I knew immediately it was a trap. A predator does not invite its prey to dinner to apologize. It invites the prey to the slaughter. But I accepted his invitation, with a trembling, hesitant voice playing the part of a lonely father, desperate for his son's affection. I drove my rusted truck into the city, parking it between rows of imported luxury vehicles outside the restaurant. I wore my faded corduroy jacket and walked with a slight, deliberate limp. The host led me to a secluded private dining room in the back of the establishment. The lighting was low, reflecting off polished mahogany walls and crystal wine glasses. Justin and Vanessa were already seated. They greeted me with wide, enthusiastic smiles that did not reach their cold, calculating eyes. Vanessa even stood up to pull out my chair, offering a sickly sweet compliment about how glad she was that I could make the trip. As I sat down, I immediately noticed a fourth-place setting at our table. Before I could ask about the extra glass, the heavy oak door of the private room opened. A man walked in wearing a sharp, tailored suit. He had slicked back hair and a smile that looked practiced in a mirror. Justin quickly stood up and introduced the man as Colin Bennett, claiming he was an old college friend who just happened to be dining at the same restaurant. Justin insisted Colin join us for a drink to catch up. I shook the man's hand. His grip was soft, but his eyes were sharp and predatory. He introduced himself as a medical consultant working with a prominent neurological institute. The alarm bells in my mind began ringing with deafening clarity. As the first course arrived, the conversation shifted abruptly. Justin and Vanessa fell completely silent, allowing their guest to take absolute control of the table. Colin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the white tablecloth, and began speaking to me in a slow, highly exaggerated tone. He did not ask me about the ranch or the weather. He asked me what day of the week it was. He asked me to name the current president. He asked me if I could remember the exact date of my late wife Barbara's passing. The questions were not conversational. They were clinical. I recognized the pattern immediately. He was administering a verbal cognitive assessment right over our appetizers. Justin and Vanessa watched me with breathless anticipation, like vultures circling a dying animal. They had brought an unlicensed hack to this dinner to write a fraudulent declaration of mental incompetence. They needed a medical professional to sign a sworn affidavit stating that my mind was completely gone, giving them the legal ammunition they required to force me into a locked state facility. If I got angry, if I yelled at this man or demanded he leave the room, I would be giving them exactly what they needed. A loud, aggressive outburst would be documented as severe paranoia and violent, erratic behavior. They wanted me to fight back, so I gave them the exact opposite. I gave them a masterpiece of a performance. I let my shoulders slump forward, staring blankly at my plate of untouched food. I forced my hands to tremble violently, making my silverware clatter against the porcelain plate. When Colin asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, I stuttered, mixed up the numbers, and eventually claimed I was just too tired to think. When he asked me about my daily routine, I spun a tragic tale of forgetting to turn off the stove and wandering the woods at night looking for Barbara. I watched out of the corner of my eye as Justin and Vanessa exchanged triumphant, thrilling glances. They were absolutely convinced their sinister plan was working flawlessly. After 45 minutes of this degrading interrogation, Colin seemed entirely satisfied with his fabricated diagnosis. He leaned back in his chair confidently, announcing that he needed to use the restroom before the main course arrived. He stood up and walked out of the private dining room. In his arrogant confidence, he left his heavy suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. Justin and Vanessa immediately turned their attention to the sommelier, who had just entered the room to present a highly expensive bottle of red wine. They were completely distracted, arguing quietly over the vintage and the price, perfectly demonstrating their endless financial irresponsibility. This was my window. I let my napkin fall to the floor. As I leaned down slowly to retrieve it, my left hand darted out with absolute precision. My phone was already unlocked and resting in the palm of my hand. I reached toward the inner breast pocket of Colin's draped jacket, where I had seen the edge of a plastic identification badge protruding earlier. Without making a single sound, I pulled the badge up just enough to expose the printed text. It was a laminated medical credential card. I tapped the screen of my phone, capturing a crystal-clear, high-definition photograph of the badge, the medical license number, and the attached hospital lanyard. I slid the badge back deep into his pocket, retrieved my napkin, and sat up straight just as the sommelier poured the wine. 2 minutes later, Colin returned to the table, completely unaware that I had just digitally secured his identity. I excused myself, apologizing weakly, and claiming that my bladder was not what it used to be. I walked slowly out of the dining room, maintaining my fragile posture until the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. The moment I was alone in the hallway, my posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. I walked into the men's restroom, locked myself inside a private stall, and opened my encrypted communication channel. I attached the photograph of the medical badge and sent it directly to Russell with a single command to run a full background check on the individual. I stood in the quiet restroom, staring at the marble tiles, waiting for my wealth manager to work his magic. Less than 3 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my palm. Russell's response was swift and completely devastating. The message confirmed that the man sitting at my table was Colin Bennett, but he was absolutely not a practicing medical consultant. Russell had accessed the state medical board's public disciplinary records. Colin Bennett had been permanently stripped of his medical license 3 years ago. He was investigated and prosecuted by the state for running a massive fraudulent prescription pill ring out of a pain management clinic. He was a disgraced convicted felon who had served time in federal prison. The sheer scale of my son's conspiracy hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Justin and Vanessa were not just greedy children trying to trick a judge with an exaggerated story. They were actively hiring convicted felons to forge state medical documents. They were paying a disgraced criminal to fabricate a psychiatric evaluation that would strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me inside an asylum for the rest of my natural life. This had escalated far beyond a family dispute over a piece of rural land. This was a highly organized criminal enterprise operating across state lines, and my own flesh and blood was the architect. I washed my hands in the gold-plated sink, looking at my reflection in the immaculate mirror. The anger inside me crystallized, turning into pure cold iron. I dried my hands, smoothed the lapels of my faded corduroy jacket, and walked back toward the private dining room. I opened the door and resumed my performance of a broken, exhausted old man. I sat down and picked at my expensive steak, listening to the 3 criminals at my table laugh and joke about their bright, prosperous future. They drank their $200 wine, celebrating what they believed was a flawless victory. They had absolutely no idea that I held the digital evidence to send every single one of them to federal prison. I chewed my food silently, letting them dig their own graves deeper with every passing minute, fully prepared to bury them all. The heavy gray clouds rolled over the jagged peaks of the Montana mountains, bringing a cold, bitter wind that rattled the window panes of my cabin. It had been exactly 48 hours since the miserable charade of a dinner at the steakhouse. I was sitting at my heavy oak desk, nursing a cup of black coffee waiting in the absolute silence of the rural morning. The trap I had laid with my wealth manager Russell was primed and ready. The bait was dangling in the digital water. It was only a matter of time before their mounting desperation pushed them to make a fatal mistake. They believed they had successfully secured the fake medical diagnosis from their disgraced doctor. They believed they held a valid power of attorney over my life. They felt invincible, and an invincible enemy is a careless enemy. The silence of the cabin was suddenly broken by a sharp, distinct vibration against the polished wood of my desk. It was my encrypted smartphone. I had assigned a very specific, subtle chime to alert me to any activity on the decoy checking account. I set down my coffee mug and picked up the device. My heart maintained a slow, steady rhythm as I opened the secure banking portal Russell had designed. The screen bathed my weathered face in a pale blue light. A notification flashed, indicating that an external user was currently attempting to bypass the primary security protocols of the local town bank. Someone was actively trying to breach the isolated account holding my supposed monthly pension. Through the back-end monitoring software, I watched the digital invasion unfold in real time. The user was initiating a total account liquidation. But they were not just trying to transfer the funds blindly. The bank system flagged that the user was actively uploading 2 supplementary files to bypass the daily withdrawal limits and establish legal authority over the account. The system captured the files. I opened them on my screen. The first document was the forged power of attorney, displaying the jagged, misspelled signature I had deliberately crafted with my left hand. The second document was the fraudulent declaration of mental incompetence signed and stamped by the convicted felon they had introduced to me as a medical consultant. They were using federal communication lines to transmit forged legal and medical documents. The sheer audacity of the theft was mesmerizing. They were targeting an account holding exactly $2,500. To a family that flaunted designer clothes and luxury vehicles, that amount of money should have been insignificant pocket change. But I knew the truth about their crushing financial ruin. I knew about the final notice of default hovering over Vanessa and her failing urban boutique. That relatively small amount of money was not a luxury for them. It was a desperate gasp for oxygen. They were trying to route my meager pension directly into an out-of-state commercial bank account registered to her failing business, trying to hold off her aggressive creditors for just one more week. Suddenly, the automated security algorithm of my local bank detected the highly suspicious nature of the transaction. The system recognized that a sudden total liquidation of a senior citizen account directed to an out-of-state commercial entity was a massive red flag. The bank firewall slammed shut. The transaction was suspended. A bright yellow warning filled my screen, indicating that the security freeze required manual authorization from the primary account holder to proceed. The money was halted in digital purgatory. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the flashing authorization prompt. This was the most critical crossroads of my entire strategy. If I allowed the bank security system to maintain the freeze, the transfer would be permanently denied. The $2,500 would remain perfectly safe in my account. But legally speaking, a blocked transaction of that size would merely constitute a state-level misdemeanor for attempted theft. It would result in a minor slap on the wrist, a fine, and perhaps a few hours of community service. They would hire expensive lawyers, claim it was a simple misunderstanding, and walk away relatively unscathed. I did not want a misunderstanding. I wanted absolute, total annihilation. To secure the crushing blow, I needed them to successfully complete the crime. I needed the stolen funds to actually leave the jurisdiction of Montana and cross state lines into Vanessa and her commercial account. The moment that stolen money crossed a geographic border via an electronic banking network, the crime would instantly elevate from a petty local theft to a severe federal felony. It would become wire fraud. Wire fraud carries mandatory federal prison sentences, crippling restitution, and the immediate involvement of federal investigative agencies. They would not be dealing with a friendly local sheriff. they would be dealing with the relentless power of the federal government. I leaned forward and placed my rough index finger against the smooth glass screen of my smartphone. Without a single moment of hesitation, I typed in my personal bypass code. I manually overrode the bank security freeze. I authorized the fraudulent transaction to proceed. I watched the screen intently as the status indicator changed from pending to processing. A few seconds later, the indicator turned a solid, bright green. The transfer was approved. The balance of the decoy account instantly plummeted from $2,500 down to zero. The money was completely gone. The trap had officially snapped shut around their ankles. The moment the funds cleared the geographic border, Russell and his advanced monitoring software went to work. The system did not just record the loss of the money. It captured a comprehensive, flawless digital fingerprint of the thief. The software secured the exact Internet Protocol address used to initiate the breach. It recorded the unique terminal identification number of the laptop. It even pinged the geographic coordinates of the wireless router, confirming that the theft had been executed directly from the luxury urban apartment my son and his wife currently rented. The evidence was irrefutable. It was a perfectly preserved digital crime scene, completely immune to any legal defense or clever manipulation. I forwarded the entire data packet directly to Russell, instructing him to compile the wire fraud evidence into a secure dossier for the federal authorities. I set the phone down and looked out the window at the rolling green pastures of the Ironweed Trust. A profound, heavy sorrow washed over me briefly, eclipsing the cold satisfaction of my tactical victory. My son Justin was a coward. He had not even executed the theft himself. He had hidden in the shadows of his luxury apartment, allowing his desperate wife to use her computer and her business accounts to drain his elderly father of what he believed were his last remaining dollars for survival. Justin had stood by and watched his wife steal my food and shelter money to pay for her designer boutique. Any lingering doubt, any tiny flickering hope that my boy could be redeemed or saved was extinguished forever in that exact moment. He had made his choice. He had chosen the shallow illusion of wealth over the blood in his own veins. The sorrow faded quickly, replaced by an impenetrable armor of resolve. They had taken the bait eagerly and blindly. They had committed a federal felony using forged medical documents and fraudulent signatures. They believed they had just successfully outsmarted a helpless old man and secured their financial future. They had absolutely no idea that every single move they made was orchestrated by the very man they were trying to destroy. I finished my cold black coffee feeling completely ready for the violence of the next phase. The invisible net was pulled tight, and it was time to let them feel the sharp bite of the wire. The dust had barely settled from their pathetic wire fraud attempt when the heavy throbbing rumble of a massive diesel engine shattered the quiet peace of my morning. I was standing near the large open bays of my main equipment shed, wiping down a wrench with an old oil rag. The ground beneath my boots vibrated as an enormous commercial flatbed truck lumbered up my long dirt driveway. It was a heavy-duty transport rig, the kind used to haul massive industrial freight, and it dragged a heavy dual-axle trailer behind it. The air brakes hissed violently as the massive vehicle ground to a halt right in front of the shed. The driver's side door swung open, and my son Justin stepped out. He was dressed in expensive casual clothes, attempting to look like a man accustomed to hard labor, but his soft hands and perfectly styled hair betrayed him instantly. He looked at me with a cold, desperate arrogance, walking toward the shed with the swagger of a man who believed he owned the entire world. Justin did not come alone. A large, burly driver remained in the cab of the transport rig, keeping the massive engine idling. Justin marched straight up to me, completely ignoring any basic human greeting. He reached into the inner pocket of his designer jacket and pulled out that familiar piece of paper. It was the fraudulent power of attorney document, complete with my intentionally misspelled left-handed signature and the stamp of the corrupt notary. He shoved the paper aggressively toward my chest, practically waving it in my face. His voice was loud and entirely devoid of any respect. He announced that since my mental health was supposedly deteriorating so rapidly, he had made the executive decision to liquidate my heavy farming equipment. He claimed he was going to sell my tractors to pay for my upcoming transition into the state-run medical facility. He stood there puffing out his chest, daring me to argue, daring me to put up a fight. He wanted a physical altercation. He wanted me to scream and shout and threaten to call the local sheriff. If I called the authorities, he would simply wave that forged legal document in their faces, claiming he was a loving son, managing the tragic affairs of a deeply confused and violent old man. It would create a messy public domestic dispute that would only lend credibility to his fake narrative. I looked past his aggressive posture and stared at the 3 massive pieces of machinery parked inside the shed. These were not cheap riding mowers. They were state-of-the-art, heavy-duty enclosed cab agricultural tractors. Each machine was a feat of modern engineering, equipped with massive treads, complex hydraulic systems, and climate-controlled cabins. Combined, they were easily worth over $500,000. To my son, they were nothing more than giant metal piggy banks waiting to be smashed open to pay off his crippling illegal debts. I looked back at Justin, letting my shoulders sag deeply. I let the oil rag slip from my fingers and fall onto the dirt floor. I painted an expression of absolute heartbroken defeat across my weathered face. I looked at the ground, shaking my head slowly, as if my spirit had finally been completely broken by his relentless cruelty. I muttered in a weak, trembling voice that a man should at least be allowed to keep his tools. Justin laughed. It was a short, sharp sound completely lacking any empathy. He told me that crazy old men do not need $500,000 farming machines. He snapped his fingers, ordering me to hand over the ignition keys immediately, or he would have his driver drag them onto the flatbed with a heavy winch. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned around and walked slowly toward the small metal lockbox mounted on the back wall of the shed. I could hear Justin sighing heavily behind me, muttering to his driver about how exhausting it was to deal with a senile old fool. I opened the lockbox and retrieved the 3 heavy sets of ignition keys. The metal jingled softly in my palm as I walked back toward the sunlight. I held my hand out, keeping my eyes locked on the dirt. Justin snatched the keys from my palm with a greedy, triumphant smirk. He actually patted me on the shoulder, a patronizing, mocking gesture, telling me I was finally making a smart decision. I stood quietly near the wooden support beam of the shed and wished him a very safe drive. I watched in total silence as my son climbed into the cab of the first massive green tractor. He struggled awkwardly to start the heavy diesel engine, clearly unfamiliar with the complex ignition sequence of commercial agricultural equipment. The engine finally roared to life, coughing a thick plume of black exhaust into the clean mountain air. For the next hour, I leaned against the wooden post, playing the part of a defeated, broken man, watching his life's work being dragged away. Justin sweated and cursed as he clumsily maneuvered each massive machine out of the shed and up the heavy steel ramps onto the commercial flatbed trailer. His designer shirt was stained with grease, and his face was red with exertion. His desperation was palpable. He was rushing, working frantically, to secure the heavy steel transport chains over the axles. He was terrified that I might suddenly change my mind, or that a neighbor might drive past and ask questions. He finally tightened the last heavy transport strap, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his dirty sleeve. He climbed up into the passenger seat of the idling transport rig, not even bothering to look back at me. The air brakes hissed again, and the massive overloaded truck began to slowly lumber down my driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as it carried hundreds of thousands of dollars of heavy machinery away from my property. I stood perfectly still until the sound of the diesel engine faded into the distant mountain wind. As soon as the dust settled, the posture of the broken old man vanished entirely. I stood up straight, a cold, satisfied smile creeping across my face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. My son believed he had just successfully bullied a helpless old man into handing over the keys to his personal property. He firmly believed he was driving away with $500,000 of quick cash to save his failing lifestyle. He was completely, fundamentally wrong on every single level. When I had contacted my wealth manager Russell to initiate Protocol Ironweed, the entire 2,000-acre ranch was transferred into a blind, irrevocable trust. But that legal shield did not just cover the dirt and the timber. It covered every single piece of commercial infrastructure on the property. Those 3 heavy-duty tractors did not belong to Calvin Hayes. Legally speaking, they were the exclusive corporate assets of the Ironweed Trust, a multi-million-dollar financial entity protected by armies of corporate lawyers. My son had not just bullied his father. He had just stolen high-value corporate property from a blind trust. Furthermore, Justin was entirely ignorant of modern agricultural technology. Those massive machines were not just dumb pieces of heavy iron. They were heavily insured commercial assets financed and monitored through sophisticated corporate channels. Because of their immense value, each tractor was factory-equipped with deeply embedded military-grade GPS transponders. These trackers were not something you could simply unscrew from the dashboard. They were hardwired directly into the massive engine blocks, drawing power straight from the primary alternators. They transmitted a continuous encrypted location signal directly to a secure server managed by Russell's firm. I opened the tracking application on my smartphone. 3 bright green dots blinked steadily on the digital map, moving slowly down the county highway. I knew exactly what my son was planning. He could not sell $500,000 of stolen agricultural equipment locally. Every rancher in this valley knew me, and they knew my machines. If he tried to pawn them off in town, he would be caught immediately. He was going to transport them out of state. He was heading for the border, probably aiming for a shady heavy equipment liquidator or a black market auction house a few hundred miles away where no one would ask questions about the hastily forged paperwork. Justin thought he was being incredibly clever, but his boundless greed was blinding him to the massive jurisdictional trap he was driving straight into. Taking a stolen vehicle down the street is a local property crime, but loading 3 high-value corporate assets onto a commercial transport rig and intentionally driving them across a state border completely changes the legal classification of the crime. The moment the tires of that heavy flatbed truck rolled over the state line, my son would no longer be committing a simple state-level theft. He would be committing federal grand theft auto and the interstate trafficking of stolen goods. He was voluntarily taking his crime out of the hands of the local county sheriff and placing it directly onto the desks of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I watched the green dots on my screen moving steadily closer and closer to the state border. I dialed Russell's direct encrypted number. He answered immediately, already monitoring the very same tracking software on his end. I told my wealth manager that the bait had been taken and the transport vehicle was currently in motion. I instructed Russell to prepare the corporate insurance claim and to draft the official stolen property reports, but to hold them back just a little longer. We needed to give Justin enough rope to fully cross the border before we snapped the snare tight. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and watched the screen with cold, calculated patience, perfectly content to let my son drive himself straight into a federal prison cell. The morning air was thick with the smell of pine and dry dust. I was sitting at my kitchen table monitoring the encrypted tracking software that showed my stolen tractors moving steadily across the state line. The federal trap was already closing around my son. But greed is a restless, impatient creature. Justin and Vanessa were not satisfied with simply stealing my heavy equipment. They wanted the land, and they wanted it immediately. The quiet peace of the valley was broken by the sound of tires crunching aggressively over the gravel of my long driveway. I closed my laptop and slid it into my canvas duffel bag. I walked to the front window and pulled back the faded curtain. A local county sheriff cruiser was parked at an odd angle right in front of my porch. Right behind the patrol car was Vanessa in her pristine imported luxury sedan. She stepped out of her vehicle wearing designer sunglasses and a sharp business suit, looking entirely out of place against the rugged backdrop of my rural property. A young deputy stepped out of the cruiser. I recognized him. He was a local boy who had always struggled with gambling debts in town. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with my cabin entirely. He was nervously adjusting his duty belt, looking like a man who knew he was committing a terrible crime. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. I did not carry a weapon, and I did not raise my voice. Vanessa marched up the wooden steps with a terrifying, confident smirk on her face. The young deputy followed closely behind her, clutching a single piece of standard printer paper in his trembling hands. Vanessa did not offer a greeting. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest and announced that the waiting game was officially over. She told me that the county had finalized the paperwork, and my presence on the property was now classified as illegal trespassing. The deputy stepped forward, refusing to look me in the eye. He held out the piece of paper. His voice shook as he told me it was a formal notice of immediate eviction. He claimed I had exactly 1 hour to gather my personal belongings and vacate the premises. If I refused to leave voluntarily, he said he would be forced to place me under arrest and physically remove me from the property. I looked down at the document. It was a complete and total fabrication. A legal eviction requires months of court hearings, served summons, and a judge's official signature. This paper was nothing more than a typed letter with a fake county seal printed from a home computer. Vanessa had bribed a desperate local cop to enforce a fake legal order, hoping to terrorize an old man into abandoning his home. Vanessa stepped closer, invading my personal space. She pulled off her sunglasses and looked at me with eyes full of pure venom. She whispered that the demolition crews were already staged just 2 miles down the highway. She said she had ordered bulldozers to wait at the county line, ready to tear this pathetic, rusted shack down to the foundation the moment I drove away. She wanted to erase my history. She wanted to destroy the home I had built with my late wife Barbara, so she could pave over the memories and build her luxury resort. She told me to pack my miserable little bags and get off her land before she lost her patience. A younger man might have fought back. I could have easily pointed out the fraudulent seal on the paper. I could have demanded the deputy call his superior officer. I could have barricaded the door and forced them to initiate a violent standoff. But engaging in a physical confrontation with a corrupt police officer would only give them the violent narrative they desperately needed to force me into an asylum. They wanted me to scream and resist. They wanted me to act like a dangerous lunatic. So I decided to give them exactly the opposite. I decided to give them a complete, absolute surrender. I let my shoulders slump heavily, playing the role of a defeated, exhausted old man whose spirit had finally been crushed. I looked at the corrupt deputy with wide, frightened eyes and nodded my head slowly. I told him in a weak, trembling voice that I did not want any trouble with the law. I asked if I could just have 5 minutes to gather some clean clothes and a picture of my late wife. Vanessa laughed out loud. It was a cruel, sharp sound that echoed across the quiet property. She waved her hand dismissively and told me to hurry up, warning me not to try and steal any of the valuable fixtures on my way out. I turned around and walked slowly back into the cabin. I did not panic and I did not rush. I went into the bedroom and packed exactly 1 canvas duffel bag. I packed a few heavy flannel shirts, my durable work pants, and the framed photograph of Barbara that sat on my nightstand. I placed my encrypted laptop securely at the bottom of the bag. I left everything else exactly where it was. I left the antique clock ticking on the wall. I left the heavy oak dining table. I left my coffee mug sitting on the kitchen counter. I zipped the canvas bag closed and slung it over my shoulder, taking one last look at the beautiful rustic interior of the home I had lived in for 40 years. I was not saying goodbye. I was simply leaving the bait. I walked back out onto the porch and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The latch clicked softly in the morning air. Vanessa was already standing near the edge of the yard, talking loudly on her cell phone, directing her demolition crews to begin moving the heavy machinery up the mountain road. The corrupt deputy was leaning against his patrol car, eager to collect his illegal bribe money and drive away from the scene of his crime. I walked slowly down the wooden steps, carrying my single bag, looking at the ground like a broken man. I walked past Vanessa's luxury sedan and tossed the bag into the passenger seat of my rusted pickup truck. Vanessa ended her phone call and walked over to my truck, resting her manicured hands on the rusty doorframe. She leaned in close and told me to enjoy the state-run medical facility. She mocked my faded clothes and my worn-out boots, telling me that people like me always end up exactly where they belong with nothing. She smiled a wide, victorious smile, completely convinced she had just successfully conquered an empire. I did not say a single word. I did not look at her. I simply put the key in the ignition, started the loud rumbling engine, and put the truck in gear. I drove away slowly, listening to the tires crunch over the gravel, leaving my home behind. As I drove down the long, winding dirt road, I looked up into the rearview mirror. I could see the cabin shrinking in the distance. Vanessa was standing triumphantly on the porch, holding her arms out wide as if she were embracing her new kingdom. The corrupt deputy climbed into his cruiser and sped off in the opposite direction, leaving her completely alone on the property, waiting for her bulldozers. The moment the cabin faded from my line of sight, the posture of the defeated old man vanished entirely. I gripped the steering wheel and a cold, hard smile spread across my face. Vanessa firmly believed she had just orchestrated a brilliant, ruthless takeover. She thought she was standing on an empty, defenseless piece of rural property, waiting to tear down a useless wooden shack. She was completely oblivious to the massive, invisible federal snare she was standing right in the middle of. When my wealth manager, Russell, initiated Protocol Ironweed and transferred the estate into the blind trust, he did not just protect the land with corporate paperwork. He established a highly secure physical perimeter to protect the corporate headquarters of the trust, which was registered precisely at the location of my cabin. Russell had hired specialized contractors to install a military-grade silent security system hidden seamlessly inside the walls of the cabin. The system was linked directly to a biometric key fob that I carried in my pocket. The moment my truck crossed the property boundary and my biometric signature left the perimeter, the entire security network automatically armed itself. The cabin was now a digitally sealed federal fortress. Vanessa was waiting for her demolition crew to arrive. She was waiting to order heavy bulldozers to smash through the walls of the structure, to destroy the historic building and clear the land. But what she did not know was that forcing entry into that cabin or attempting to cause structural damage to the corporate headquarters of a multi-million-dollar blind trust would not trigger a loud local siren. It would not alert the corrupt local sheriff. It would trigger a direct, silent distress signal routed instantly to the nearest field office of the United States Marshals Service. By bribing a local officer to stage an illegal eviction using forged documents, Vanessa had escalated her greed into a severe federal offense. She thought she was preparing to knock down an old man's house. In reality, she was about to forcefully breach a federally protected corporate asset. I turned my truck onto the main highway, driving smoothly toward the city where I would meet Russell. The trap was perfectly set. Vanessa was standing alone on the porch, celebrating a victory that did not exist, proudly waiting for the heavily armed federal agents to descend upon her and place her in handcuffs. The silent adjustment was moving exactly as planned. The evening air in the city felt heavy and thick, completely lacking the crisp pine scent of my mountain home. I stood in the bustling service corridor of the most opulent luxury hotel in the downtown financial district. The grand ballroom beyond the double swinging doors was overflowing with the wealthiest real estate investors in the region. I was not wearing my worn leather boots or my faded corduroy jacket. Instead, I wore a perfectly pressed, pristine white catering uniform. Russell, my wealth manager, had utilized his extensive corporate connections to secure me a temporary position on the evening waitstaff. It was the absolute perfect disguise. I had learned a very valuable lesson at my son's wedding reception. I learned that the incredibly wealthy simply do not look at the people serving them. To men like Vanessa's father, people in uniforms are entirely invisible. We are just moving pieces of furniture meant to deliver expensive champagne and clear away dirty plates. They never look at our faces. They never look into our eyes. I picked up a polished silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of sparkling wine and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of overwhelming greed, disguised as high society. Massive diamond chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of men in tailored tuxedos and women in designer gowns. They laughed loudly, clinking their glasses and discussing millions of dollars as if they were talking about the weather. I moved smoothly through the crowded room, keeping my head slightly bowed, offering drinks to the passing guests. My hands did not tremble. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. I was a phantom walking right through the center of their fraudulent empire. At the far end of this ballroom stood a massive, elevated stage draped in heavy black velvet. Behind the podium hung a gigantic digital projection screen, waiting to display the grand vision of their stolen land. I carefully navigated my way toward the front of the room, stopping near a towering floral arrangement. I needed to see my son. I needed to see exactly how comfortable he had become with his own corruption. Justin and Vanessa were standing near the front row of tables, holding court, with a group of older, wealthy investors. Vanessa wore a sparkling emerald gown that dragged elegantly across the polished floor. She was throwing her head back and laughing, soaking in the adoration and respect of her peers. She firmly believed she had successfully evicted a broken old man from his only home just a few hours ago. She thought her demolition crews were tearing down my cabin, right at this very moment. Justin stood beside her, gripping a glass of scotch. He looked completely transformed. He wore a custom velvet tuxedo and a smug, confident smile that made him look exactly like his arrogant father-in-law. He was happily accepting handshakes and congratulations from the elite businessman, treating my stolen property as his ultimate trophy. The boy I had taught to mend fences and respect the earth was entirely gone. He had sold his soul for a velvet tuxedo and a glass of expensive liquor. The ballroom lights dimmed slowly, signaling the beginning of the main presentation. A hushed, expectant silence fell over the massive crowd. Vanessa's father walked confidently up the carpeted steps onto the main stage. He approached the polished glass podium, gripping the edges with his heavy hands. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors with the absolute arrogance of a king surveying his conquered lands. He tapped the microphone, and his booming theatrical voice echoed through the massive surround sound speakers. He welcomed his wealthy friends and corporate partners, thanking them for attending this exclusive private unveiling. He announced that his development conglomerate had just successfully acquired 2,000 acres of pristine virgin territory in the heart of Montana. He proudly bragged that the land was completely unencumbered, featuring fresh running rivers, deep ancient forests, and the most breathtaking mountain views in the entire country. He called it the ultimate blank canvas, ready to be transformed into an exclusive multi-million-dollar eco-resort and luxury spa for the elite. He spoke about the land Barbara and I had loved with such casual, aggressive greed that it took every ounce of my willpower not to drop my silver tray. Then he did something that truly solidified my resolve. He asked the audience to direct their attention to the front row. He proudly called Justin and Vanessa up to the stage. He announced to the crowd of wealthy investors that his brilliant daughter and his incredibly sharp new son-in-law had been the lead acquisition executives on this massive deal. He praised their ruthless business acumen. He claimed they had navigated complex rural negotiations to secure the property for a fraction of its true market value. The audience erupted in loud, enthusiastic applause. Justin and Vanessa walked up the steps, waving to the crowd, smiling like celebrated conquerors. Justin actually puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of himself. He was publicly taking credit for stealing his own father's home. He was standing on a stage accepting applause for a brutal felony. I turned my back on the stage and slipped quietly through a side exit door, entering a dark, carpeted hallway that ran behind the main ballroom walls. I set my silver tray down on a small utility table and pulled a cloned electronic keycard from my uniform pocket. Russell had provided the keycard, guaranteeing me unrestricted access to the hotel's back-end infrastructure. I walked swiftly down the silent corridor until I reached a heavy metal door marked Audio-Visual Control. I swiped the keycard. The light blinked green, and the heavy door clicked unlocked. I stepped into the dark control room. It was a small elevated booth featuring a wide tinted glass window that looked directly out over the grand ballroom. From this high vantage point, I could see the tops of the crystal chandeliers and the entire main stage perfectly. The room was filled with complex, glowing soundboards, digital mixing consoles, and heavy computer servers. A single young hotel technician was sitting in a rolling chair, wearing heavy headphones, and watching a sports game on his phone. I approached him quietly, pulling a thick envelope from my pocket. I tapped him gently on the shoulder. He jumped, pulling off his headphones and looking at me in confusion. I handed him the envelope, which contained exactly $5,000 in crisp $100 bills. I told him in a very calm, friendly voice that he needed to take a 30-minute coffee break outside the building and that he had never seen me. The young man looked inside the envelope, his eyes going wide. He swallowed hard, nodded his head silently, grabbed his phone, and practically ran out of the control room. I was completely alone. I walked over to the primary projection mainframe. I unzipped my uniform jacket and pulled out my highly secure encrypted laptop. I plugged my computer directly into the hotel's master video feed, bypassing their internal presentation software entirely. I opened a carefully curated digital file folder on my desktop, preparing my ammunition. Through the tinted glass window, I watched Vanessa's father, standing at the podium, flanked by Justin and Vanessa. He was reaching the grand crescendo of his arrogant speech. His voice boomed through the monitors inside my control booth. He was telling the investors that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get in on the ground floor of an absolute gold mine. He aggressively promised massive financial returns, demanding that they open their checkbooks and commit their millions tonight. He raised his hand dramatically, pointing toward the massive blank digital screen hanging directly behind him. He announced that he was thrilled to finally unveil the official architectural blueprints for their luxurious new mountain empire. The audience leaned forward, holding their breath in wealthy anticipation. Justin and Vanessa turned around, smiling brightly, at the blank screen, ready to admire the digital rendering of their stolen prize. I rested my rough, calloused finger over the enter key on my laptop. They had invited hundreds of the wealthiest people in the city to witness their brilliant success. I decided it was only fair to give their prominent guests exactly what they came for. I pressed the key and hijacked the master feed completely, taking control of their perfect night. The massive digital screen behind the stage flickered with a sudden violent flash of bright white light. The soft ambient music that had been playing in the ballroom cut out instantly. A heavy static hiss crackled through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. Down on the main stage, Vanessa and her father turned around with wide, expectant smiles, fully anticipating a gorgeous digital rendering of their luxury eco-resort. The wealthy investors sitting at the round tables leaned forward in their velvet chairs, holding their breath. But the image that materialized on the gigantic screen was not a beautiful architectural blueprint. It was a grainy, high-definition night vision video bathed in a ghostly green and black glow. A collective murmur of profound confusion swept through the grand ballroom. The investors squinted at the massive screen, trying to understand what they were looking at. The video displayed a desolate rural landscape in the dead of night. Then, a dark luxury sport utility vehicle crept into the frame. The high-resolution lens captured the rear license plate with absolute perfect clarity. I watched from the elevated control booth as Vanessa physically recoiled on the stage, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. She recognized her own vehicle immediately. The confusion in the ballroom deepened as the driver's side door opened on the screen. A man stepped out into the freezing night air, pulling the hood of his dark jacket up over his head. He walked directly toward the camera, and the infrared flash illuminated his face in stark, undeniable detail. It was Justin. The murmurs in the crowd instantly transformed into loud gasps of shock. The wealthy elite were watching the groom of the year, the supposed brilliant acquisition executive, sneaking around in the dark like a common thug. The video continued playing silently but powerfully. Justin approached a massive metal agricultural water pump. He raised a heavy pair of industrial bolt cutters. The sound of snapping metal and shattering brass suddenly echoed through the massive speakers, thundering across the quiet ballroom. Every single guest watched in absolute horror as my son violently slashed through thick, specialized wiring and deliberately destroyed essential farming infrastructure. They watched him commit felony agricultural sabotage right before their very eyes. Down on the stage, this panic was absolute. Vanessa's father slammed his heavy hands onto the glass podium, shouting into the microphone for the hotel technicians to cut the feed immediately. His face was bright red with furious embarrassment. He demanded that someone turn off the projector, but his booming voice only added to the chaotic spectacle. Justin stood frozen next to his wife, his face completely drained of color. His smug, confident smile had vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He was watching his own secret midnight crime being broadcast to every major financial player in the city. He realized in that agonizing moment that he had lost complete control of his carefully crafted narrative. Before the shock could even begin to settle, the massive screen flashed again. The green and black video faded away, replaced by a bright, high-resolution scanned image of a legal document. It was the quitclaim deed, the very foundation of their entire multi-million-dollar resort project. I had zoomed the image in specifically on the bottom signature line. The jagged, erratic handwriting was blown up to massive proportions for every investor to see. The misspelled middle name was glaringly obvious. A heavy silence fell over the room as the wealthy businessmen and their sharp corporate lawyers scrutinized the massive image. They realized instantly that the signature was a sloppy forgery. They realized the legal document transferring the 2,000-acre ranch was completely invalid. The entire foundation of the luxury eco-resort they were being asked to fund was a total, absolute fabrication. The screen suddenly went pitch black, but the presentation was not over. The heavy silence in the ballroom was shattered by a crystal-clear audio recording playing through the massive speakers. It was the recording I had captured on my front porch just hours ago. Vanessa's voice, shrill and dripping with venomous greed, filled the grand room. She was heard clearly stating her intention to forcefully evict a helpless old man. She explicitly detailed her plans to bring in heavy machinery and ruthlessly bulldoze the historic cabin by the end of the month just to clear the view for her resort. Justin's voice chimed in right after hers, eagerly agreeing that the land was worth significantly more without the trash sitting on it. The sheer cruelty and blatant illegality of their recorded words hung in the air like a thick, foul smoke. The grand ballroom erupted into absolute, total chaos. The polite whispers of high society vanished, replaced by furious shouts and angry demands. Wealthy investors pushed their velvet chairs back and stood up, pointing accusatory fingers at the stage. Men in tailored tuxedos began shouting at Vanessa's father, demanding their investment commitments back immediately. They realized they had been invited to a gala to fund a massive fraudulent land grab built on forged documents and elder abuse. The illusion of the sophisticated corporate acquisition was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Vanessa's father tried to speak over the roaring crowd, but the investors completely ignored him, turning their backs and marching toward the main exit doors in droves. Justin frantically scanned the panicked room, his chest heaving with desperate, rapid breaths. He looked past the angry investors and his eyes locked onto the tinted glass window of the elevated audio-visual control booth. The glow of my encrypted laptop illuminated my face in the dark room. Justin saw me standing there dressed in the crisp white catering uniform, looking down at him with an expression of absolute cold finality. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He finally understood that his helpless, uneducated father had meticulously orchestrated this entire digital execution. He understood that the old man he thought he had conquered had just publicly destroyed his life, his marriage, and his future. Something inside Justin completely snapped. The public humiliation and the total collapse of his fraudulent empire drove him into a state of blind, unhinged fury. He jumped off the elevated stage, stumbling over the heavy velvet curtains, and began sprinting down the carpeted center aisle. He shoved wealthy investors and panicked hotel staff out of his way, running toward the back of the ballroom with pure murderous intent. I stood perfectly still inside the control booth, watching his desperate charge. I did not attempt to lock the door. I did not call for the hotel security team. I simply waited in the quiet darkness of the small room. The heavy metal door of the control booth flew open with a violent crash, rebounding off the inner wall. Justin burst into the room, his face twisted into a mask of pure, feral rage. He was screaming curses, sweating through his expensive custom velvet tuxedo. He lunged directly at me, raising his clenched fists, preparing to strike the old man who had just dismantled his world. He expected me to cower. He expected me to raise my trembling hands to protect my face. I did neither. I maintained my perfectly calm demeanor and simply took one smooth, deliberate step to the side. I did not raise a single finger against my own son. I let his own blind, aggressive momentum seal his fate. Justin was moving far too fast to stop his reckless charge. As I stepped out of his path, his heavy, swinging fists met nothing but empty air. He lost his balance completely, stumbling forward with all of his weight. He crashed violently headfirst into a massive towering rack of heavy metal servers and solid steel amplifier equipment. The impact was a loud, sickening crunch of bone and bending metal. The heavy equipment rack tipped backward, sending a shower of sparks and loose wires raining down over him. Justin collapsed to the carpeted floor in a pathetic, crumpled heap, groaning in intense physical pain. His designer suit was torn, his face was bruised, and his arrogant pride was permanently extinguished. I stood over him, looking down at the broken man who had sold his soul for a lie. The presentation was finally over. The heavy silence inside the control booth was broken by the sharp, clear sound of the grand ballroom doors swinging open. I watched through the tinted glass as a team of federal agents dressed in dark suits walked purposefully down the center aisle. Leading them was Russell, my wealth manager, his expression an absolute mask of professional steel. The chaos in the room immediately subsided, replaced by a tense, suffocating quiet. The remaining investors backed away, clearing a wide path for the authorities. Russell did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply walked up the carpeted steps onto the main stage and approached Vanessa's father. The arrogant real estate developer was pale, sweating profusely, and clutching the edges of the glass podium. Russell pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and dropped them onto the podium with a loud, authoritative thud. He announced in a voice that carried perfectly across the silent ballroom that he was serving official notice. He detailed a massive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against the development conglomerate, citing deliberate corporate fraud, criminal conspiracy, and the attempted illegal seizure of protected federal trust lands. He then presented a federal cease and desist order demanding the immediate suspension of all related business operations. Vanessa's father tried to argue, his voice trembling and weak. He claimed he knew nothing about forged documents or stolen property. He pointed an accusatory finger at Justin, trying desperately to throw his new son-in-law under the bus to save his own empire. But Russell simply smiled a cold, sharp smile. He told the developer that the federal investigators were already seizing his corporate hard drives and executing search warrants on his offshore accounts. The empire built on greed and corruption was collapsing in real time. Down on the floor, Vanessa was hyperventilating. Her pristine emerald gown was stained with spilled champagne, and her perfect composure was completely shattered. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that she was about to be arrested. She pulled her phone from her designer purse, her manicured fingers shaking violently. She was trying to access her private banking applications, desperately attempting to transfer any remaining liquid assets to an offshore account so she could book a private flight out of the country. She thought she could outrun the consequences. I watched from the booth as she tapped furiously at her screen. Suddenly, she let out a piercing, terrified shriek. She stared at her phone, her eyes wide with total disbelief. Her screen had flashed bright red, displaying a severe federal security warning. Russell had submitted the pristine wire fraud evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier that morning. The trap I had set with the decoy checking account had worked flawlessly. The federal authorities had moved swiftly and decisively, freezing every single one of Vanessa's business and personal accounts. The massive debts she had been trying to hide were now exposed, and she was instantly destitute, while Vanessa sobbed uncontrollably. Justin was still lying on the floor, groaning in pain from his collision with the server rack. His phone began vibrating wildly in his torn jacket pocket. He struggled to answer it, his hands slick with sweat. Through the audio monitors, I heard the panicked voice of the heavy equipment buyer on the other end of the line. The buyer was screaming, cursing at Justin, demanding to know why federal agents had just raided his black market auction house. The authorities had successfully tracked the hidden GPS transponders inside the stolen tractors. The $500,000 in heavy machinery had been seized, and the buyer was furious. Justin dropped his phone, letting it clatter against the floor. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was not going to get the quick cash he desperately needed. He was not going to pay off his crippling debts. He was bankrupt. He was a fraud. And he was facing severe federal charges for grand theft auto and wire fraud. The luxurious life he had stolen from me was gone forever, replaced by a terrifying, inescapable reality. The financial guillotine had finally dropped, severing them from their stolen wealth and plunging them into absolute ruin. The sheer panic radiating from my son and his new wife was palpable, even from the elevated control booth. I watched through the tinted glass as the reality of their situation completely crushed them. The federal agents were already moving through the ballroom, securing evidence and taking statements from the furious investors. Justin pulled himself up from the floor, clutching his bruised ribs with a grimace of pure agony. He grabbed Vanessa by the arm, pulling her away from the stage. They shoved their way past the bewildered elite guests, fleeing the grand ballroom like cornered feral animals. They knew their bank accounts were frozen. They knew the federal authorities had seized their stolen agricultural equipment. But in their desperate criminal minds, they believed they still had one tiny sliver of hope. They knew the physical forged documents bearing the corrupt notary stamp and my manipulated left-handed signature were still sitting in the heavy oak desk inside my cabin. They firmly believed that if they could destroy that paper trail, a high-priced defense attorney might be able to create just enough reasonable doubt to save them from a federal penitentiary. They were going to attempt the 2-hour drive back to the Montana ranch in record time, fueled entirely by raw adrenaline and absolute terror. I did not rush. I walked calmly out of the control booth and took the discreet service elevator down to the underground parking garage. My wealth manager, Russell, was already waiting for me inside a black armored sport utility vehicle. Russell had anticipated their exact escape route long before the presentation even began. The winding mountain highway would take them at least 90 minutes, driving at reckless, dangerous speeds. We were not going to drive. Russell had arranged for a private twin-engine charter helicopter to wait for us at the municipal helipad just blocks away from the luxury hotel. We bypassed the congested city traffic entirely, flying straight over the dark, sprawling mountain ranges. As I looked down through the cabin window at the ribbon of interstate highway below, I caught a brief, distant glimpse of a luxury sedan weaving erratically through the midnight traffic. It was them racing blindly toward a destination that no longer belonged to them. The helicopter landed softly and silently on the far western ridge of my property, miles away from the main cabin, ensuring they would not hear our approach over the howling mountain wind. Russell and his armed security detail remained at the perimeter of the estate, coordinating directly with the United States Marshals Service, who had already quietly surrounded the dense woods. I walked down the familiar dirt path entirely alone, entering my cabin through the reinforced back door. The air inside was perfectly still, holding the comforting, familiar scent of old pine wood and dust. I did not turn on a single lamp. I moved through the absolute darkness with the ingrained muscle memory of a man who had lived within these walls for 4 decades. I went straight to the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of black coffee, the rich, earthy aroma grounding my mind in the present moment. I poured the dark liquid into my favorite ceramic mug, walked into the living room, and sat down in my heavy leather armchair. The darkness wrapped around me, providing a calm, silent sanctuary. Outside, the Montana wind began to whistle violently through the ancient trees, a lonely, haunting sound that perfectly masked the approach of the federal agents hiding in the brush. I sat in perfect silence, taking slow, measured sips of my coffee, waiting for my own flesh and blood to break into the home he grew up in. Sitting in that pitch-black room, I thought about the boy I had raised. I remembered building a wooden toy box in the corner of this very room, watching Justin play on the floor while Barbara cooked dinner. I had given him every opportunity an honest life could offer. I had tried to teach him the profound value of hard work, of respecting the land, and of protecting his family. But the city and the relentless pursuit of unearned wealth had poisoned his mind completely. The son I had loved was dead, and the man speeding up my driveway tonight was nothing more than a desperate, dangerous thief. I felt no sorrow anymore. The tears had all dried up, leaving behind an impenetrable armor of cold justice. About 40 minutes later, the distinct, aggressive crunch of gravel broke the natural silence of the valley. A vehicle coasted up the long driveway with its headlights completely turned off, trying to maintain a stealthy, invisible approach. The engine cut out abruptly. Through the thin wooden walls of the cabin, I could hear their frantic, heavy breathing and their desperate, hushed whispers. Justin was cursing bitterly, complaining about the sharp pain in his ribs, while Vanessa urged him to hurry up before the local county sheriff decided to do a random wellness check. They walked quickly up onto the wooden porch. The old floorboards creaked under their heavy weight, exactly in the spots I knew they would. Justin tried the front door handle, but the deadbolt was firmly locked. He muttered another string of violent curses. Then came the harsh, destructive sound of a heavy rock striking glass. The large window next to the front door shattered inward, raining sharp, jagged pieces of glass across my polished hardwood floor. Justin reached his bleeding hand through the broken pane, unlocking the interior window latch and pushing the heavy wooden frame violently upward. He climbed clumsily through the opening, tearing his expensive velvet tuxedo on the jagged edges of the broken glass. He grunted heavily as he hit the floor, followed closely by Vanessa, who tumbled into the dark living room, clutching her ruined emerald silk gown. They scrambled to their feet, moving blindly through the pitch-black room, breathing like hunted animals. Vanessa desperately whispered that the forged documents were in the main desk drawer and that they needed to burn them in the stone fireplace immediately. Justin took a step forward, his boots crunching loudly over the broken glass. He reached into his torn pocket to pull out his smartphone, hoping to use the flashlight application. That was the exact moment I pressed the small electronic remote resting comfortably in the palm of my left hand. The smart lighting system Russell had secretly installed flared to life instantly. Every single lamp, overhead fixture, and porch light in the cabin snapped on at maximum brightness, flooding the room with a blindingly harsh illumination. Justin and Vanessa shrieked, throwing their hands up to shield their sensitive eyes from the sudden, painful glare. As their vision slowly adjusted to the light, they lowered their hands and froze, completely paralyzed by absolute terror. I was sitting perfectly still in my leather armchair, my legs crossed, calmly resting my warm coffee mug on my knee. I did not look surprised, and I did not look afraid. I looked at them with the cold, absolute certainty of a judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. Justin stood there, bleeding slightly from a deep cut on his hand, his face completely devoid of color. He looked around the pristine, untouched cabin, realizing that his ordered demolition crews had never arrived, and that his entire reality was a carefully constructed, flawless illusion. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, hollow excuse to his father, but the words died completely in his throat. Before he could utter a single syllable, the darkness outside the cabin was violently erased. Intense, flashing red and blue lights erupted through every window in the house, painting their terrified faces in the colors of absolute ruin. The heavy, synchronized thumping of combat boots surrounded the wooden porch. The United States Marshals had moved in, sealing the perimeter perfectly. The silent alarm had worked exactly as intended, and the final desperate escape of my greedy son had officially reached its dead end. The heavy oak front door of my cabin did not simply open. It was violently obliterated. The reinforced battering ram of the United States Marshals Service splintered the thick wood into 1,000 jagged pieces, sending the heavy brass deadbolt flying across the living room to smash against the stone fireplace. Tactical boots hit the hardwood floor with deafening, synchronized precision. 6 federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and heavy ballistic vests flooded into the small space, their flashlights cutting through the blinding glare of my overhead lamps. They moved with absolute ruthless efficiency, shouting commands that echoed off the rustic walls, demanding that everyone freeze and keep their hands clearly visible. Justin and Vanessa were completely paralyzed, standing amid the broken glass of the window they had just smashed. The sheer physical dominance of the federal authorities entering my home stripped away every last ounce of their arrogant corporate bravado. They were no longer the smug, wealthy elites who had laughed at my faded clothes. They were cornered, desperate criminals facing the terrifying reality of federal prison. The lead marshal, a tall, imposing man with a stern, uncompromising expression, stepped directly into the center of the room. He pointed a heavy flashlight straight at my son, ordering him to drop to his knees and lace his fingers behind his head. That was the exact moment the final illusion of their marriage completely shattered. Before the marshal could take another step toward them, Vanessa threw her hands high into the air, taking a frantic, stumbling step away from her husband. She did not reach out to comfort the man she had married just weeks ago. She did not stand by his side to face the consequences of the crimes they had committed together. Instead, she turned on him with the vicious, terrifying speed of a cornered snake. Vanessa began to scream, her voice shrill and dripping with fake, hysterical tears. She pointed her manicured finger directly at Justin's chest, frantically telling the federal agents that she had absolutely nothing to do with this. She shrieked that Justin was a manipulative monster who had orchestrated the entire fraud entirely on his own. She claimed he had lied to her wealthy father, telling them the ranch was legally his to sell. She swore she was completely innocent, pleading that Justin had forced her to come here tonight, under the threat of physical violence, to destroy documents she had never even seen. She loudly blamed him for the forged signature, shifting the entire weight of the criminal conspiracy onto his shoulders in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save her own luxurious lifestyle. She begged the marshals to call her father, claiming her family was just another victim of Justin's psychotic greed. I remained seated in my leather armchair, my coffee mug resting calmly on my knee, watching the brutal psychological destruction of my own son. Justin slowly turned his head to look at his new wife. He was bleeding from the cuts on his hand. His expensive velvet tuxedo was torn, and his chest was heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. But the physical pain he was enduring was absolutely nothing compared to the complete devastation washing over his face at that very moment. He stared at Vanessa with wide, horrified eyes, entirely unable to comprehend the magnitude of her betrayal. This was the woman he had sacrificed his own father for. This was the woman he had committed multiple federal felonies to please. He had severed his own water lines, stolen his father's farming equipment, and attempted to lock me inside an insane asylum solely to finance her extravagant boutique and impress her arrogant family. As Justin looked into her cold, calculating eyes, the devastating truth finally hit him with the force of a freight train. He realized with absolute sickening clarity that she had never loved him. She had never respected him. To Vanessa and her wealthy father, Justin was never a husband or a business partner. He was merely a convenient, gullible tool, a naive local boy they could easily manipulate to secure a multi-million-dollar piece of prime Montana real estate. They had used his desperate desire for elite social status to turn him into the perfect, disposable scapegoat. The moment their fraudulent empire collapsed, she eagerly and ruthlessly threw him to the wolves, hoping the federal agents would devour him and let her walk away unharmed. Justin fell to his knees on the hardwood floor, not because the marshals ordered him to, but because his legs simply could no longer support the crushing weight of his ruined life. He looked down at the broken glass scattered around his boots, silent tears finally spilling over his bruised cheeks. He had traded his soul, his family, and his freedom for an illusion that had evaporated the second the flashing red and blue lights hit the window. I slowly placed my ceramic coffee mug down on the small wooden table beside my chair. The soft clink of the ceramic against the wood seemed to draw the attention of the entire room. I stood up, taking a slow, deliberate moment to straighten the lapels of my faded corduroy jacket. I did not look at my weeping son, and I did not look at his screaming, treacherous wife. I looked directly at the lead federal marshal. I walked calmly toward the center of the room, stepping carefully over the shattered glass. From the inner pocket of my jacket, I pulled out a thick, heavily reinforced manila envelope. I had prepared this precise package with my wealth manager, Russell, exactly for this inevitable moment. I handed the envelope to the lead marshal, maintaining my quiet, dignified composure. I told the marshal that he would find everything he needed to secure a conviction inside that envelope. My voice was steady, perfectly contrasting the hysterical sobbing of the woman standing a few feet away. I explained that the first document was the original forged quitclaim deed, featuring the erratic left-handed signature I had deliberately created to prove extortion and coercion under duress. I told him that the second set of documents contained the exact global positioning system logs directly from the 3 heavy-duty agricultural tractors my son had stolen. The logs explicitly proved that the insured corporate assets had been intentionally transported across state lines, establishing undeniable federal grand theft auto. Vanessa stopped screaming for a brief second, listening to my words. I turned my gaze toward her, offering a cold, empty smile. I told the marshal that the final document in the envelope was the most important one. It was a comprehensive, certified digital footprint report generated by my bank's advanced security algorithms. The report contained the exact internet protocol addresses, terminal identification numbers, and geographic routing data from the attempted wire fraud transfer earlier that morning. I looked Vanessa directly in the eyes and watched the last drop of hope drain from her pale, terrified face. I informed the federal agents that the digital forensic report conclusively proved that the wire fraud, the attempt to steal $2,500 from an elderly man's pension account, was executed directly from Vanessa's personal laptop using her own secure business accounts. Her desperate attempt to throw my son under the bus was completely useless. The digital evidence tied her directly to the absolute center of the federal conspiracy. She was not a victim. She was the primary architect of the theft, and I had just handed the United States government the exact weapon they needed to bury her. The lead marshal opened the envelope, scanning the pristine, documented evidence. He gave a sharp, curt nod to the agents standing behind him. The officers moved in swiftly, ignoring Vanessa's renewed, frantic pleas and Justin's quiet, broken sobbing. They grabbed Justin by his torn tuxedo jacket, pulling his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of the cold steel handcuffs closing tightly around his wrists echoed through the cabin, finalizing the total loss of his freedom. 2 other agents stepped toward Vanessa. She tried to back away, swinging her arms and screaming that she wanted her father, that she wanted her lawyer, that she belonged to an important family. The agents were entirely unimpressed by her imaginary wealth. They grabbed her wrists, forcing her arms behind her back, with professional, uncompromising force. The second set of steel handcuffs clicked shut, binding the wealthy elite socialite in the exact same cold iron as the local country boy she had tried to exploit. The marshals dragged them roughly toward the shattered front door, pulling them out into the freezing mountain night. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their faces as they were shoved into the back of separate, heavily armored federal transport vehicles. I stood quietly in the center of my living room, surrounded by the splintered wood and broken glass of the life they had tried to destroy. The deafening silence of the Montana wilderness slowly returned to the valley as the heavy engines of the transport vehicles roared to life, carrying my son and his treacherous wife away to their inevitable ruin. The winter snows came early to the Montana Valley, burying the shattered glass and the tire tracks left behind by the federal agents. In the weeks that followed the midnight raid, the aggressive, arrogant empire built by Vanessa and her wealthy father completely unraveled. The digital evidence my wealth manager Russell had forwarded to the federal authorities acted like a spark in a dry forest. Once the investigators began looking into the shell companies used to file the fraudulent zoning permits, they uncovered a massive labyrinth of illegal corporate practices. Vanessa held executive titles in dozens of these phantom corporations. Her father had used her as a shield for years to hide his predatory real estate acquisitions and offshore tax evasions. When the news of their arrests became public, the wealthy elite investors who had attended the Grand Gala panicked. They realized their money was tied up in a federally indicted criminal enterprise. The panic quickly turned into a stampede of aggressive civil lawsuits. Within a month, the sprawling development conglomerate was buried under federal scrutiny and frozen assets. Vanessa watched from a cold jail cell as her father lost everything he had ever built. His luxury cars were repossessed. His towering office buildings were seized by the government. The arrogant man who had openly mocked my worn boots and faded suit at the wedding reception was now completely bankrupt, stripped of his power, and facing his own extensive criminal indictments. The concrete shopping centers and luxury spas he loved so much could not protect him from the relentless grinding gears of the justice system. The man who tried to steal my home was now completely homeless. I did not attend the final sentencing hearings. I had already looked my son in the eyes and said everything that needed to be said on the night of his arrest. Russell attended the court proceedings on my behalf and relayed the details to me over a quiet phone call. Justin and Vanessa had spent their entire time in federal custody, desperately trying to blame one another. Vanessa claimed Justin was a violent mastermind who forced her to participate in the forgery. Justin cried to the prosecutors that Vanessa and her father had manipulated his desire for their approval, tricking him into betraying his own flesh and blood. The federal prosecutors were completely unimpressed by their pathetic, shifting narratives. They had the pristine audio recordings, the digital wire fraud footprints, and the global positioning logs from the stolen tractors. The case was absolutely bulletproof. Facing the terrifying prospect of decades in a maximum security penitentiary if they went to trial, both of them finally surrendered. They accepted strict federal plea deals. There was no leniency and no preferential treatment for the formerly wealthy socialite. The judge handed down identical 15-year sentences in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Justin, the boy I had raised to respect the land and honor his family, would spend the next 15 years locked inside a concrete cell. He would lose his youth, his freedom, and the luxurious future he had sacrificed his soul to obtain. When Russell told me the final verdict, I did not celebrate. I did not feel a rush of joyful victory. I simply felt a profound, heavy sense of closure. The toxic infection that had slowly poisoned my family was completely and permanently excised. I could finally breathe without waiting for the next betrayal. With the criminals safely locked away and the legal threats entirely neutralized, I turned my attention to the future of the ranch. The confrontation had taught me a very harsh but necessary lesson. As long as this massive, unencumbered property existed as a private commercial asset, it would always attract vultures. It would always be a target for greedy developers and predatory individuals looking for a quick fortune. I needed to ensure that no corporate entity could ever pave over the deep green pastures and the ancient timber forests that my late wife Barbara had loved so fiercely. I invited Russell out to the cabin for a long weekend. We sat at my heavy oak dining table, drinking black coffee and poring over the expansive topographical maps of the estate. I told my wealth manager that I wanted to build an impenetrable fortress around the heart of the land. We drafted a brilliant, legally binding conservation strategy. I officially carved out 1,500 acres of the most beautiful and vulnerable territory on the ranch, including the pristine river valleys and the dense eastern ridge they had tried to survey. I transferred the total ownership of those 1,500 acres directly into a federally protected National Wildlife Conservation Trust. By legally reclassifying the land as a permanent environmental sanctuary, I ensured that no one could ever build a hotel, a spa, or a shopping center on that soil. The land was permanently retired from the commercial market. It would remain wild, untouched, and beautiful for generations to come. It was the absolute perfect tribute to Barbara. Her legacy was no longer just a memory. It was a living, breathing sanctuary completely immune to human greed. I kept the remaining 500 acres and the historic cabin for myself. I hired a local crew of honest, hard-working carpenters to repair the damage caused by the break-in. They replaced the shattered front window with thick, tempered glass and rebuilt the wooden porch, making it stronger and more resilient than ever before. I threw away the old faded suits and bought myself comfortable, durable new clothes. I no longer had to pretend to be a poor, helpless tenant. I was Calvin Hayes, the quiet guardian of a mountain sanctuary, living exactly the way I wanted to live. I was finally free. Spring arrived in the Montana Valley, melting the heavy winter snows and painting the rolling pastures in brilliant, vibrant shades of green. I woke up early on a crisp, clear morning and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The rich, familiar aroma filled the renovated cabin, blending perfectly with the scent of pine drifting in through the open windows. I poured my coffee into a ceramic mug and walked out onto my sturdy wooden porch. I sat down in my favorite rocking chair, feeling the smooth, polished wood beneath my hands. The morning air was remarkably clean and sharp, completely free of the suffocating perfume and the loud, arrogant voices of the city. I looked out over the vast, sprawling expanse of the Protected Wildlife Trust. A small herd of deer was grazing peacefully near the tree line, entirely undisturbed. The fast-running creek sparkled under the rising sun. There were no commercial drones buzzing in the sky. There were no luxury vehicles kicking up dust on my driveway. There were no corrupt notaries or greedy developers plotting in the shadows. The mountains were completely quiet, holding the deep, ancient silence of the earth. I took a slow, deep sip of my hot coffee, feeling the warmth spread pleasantly through my chest. I looked out at the distant, jagged peaks rising sharply against the bright blue sky. The horizon was absolutely unbroken. There were no concrete buildings obstructing the beautiful natural view. The long, painful war was over, and the peace I had fought so fiercely to protect was finally and fully restored. I gently rocked back and forth in my chair, listening to the wind moving softly through the tall green grass. I felt Barbara smiling down on me, knowing her beautiful home was safe forever. The silent adjustment is complete. The most profound lesson from Calvin's journey is that true wealth is not measured by the luxury you display, but by the quiet power of your character and the boundaries you enforce. Blood does not automatically make someone family. Respect, loyalty, and unconditional love do. When you protect your peace and refuse to be a victim of someone else's greed, you discover a strength that no amount of money can buy. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is to step aside and let the crushing weight of reality teach their children the harsh consequences of their actions. If Calvin's story inspired you to stand your ground and protect your peace against toxic people, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories, and let me know in the comments how you would have handled this ultimate betrayal.